I'm delighted that Olivia Heffernan, who currently works in the Scottish Parliament as part of a Parliamentary Internship Program run through the University of Edinburgh in partnership with Arcadia, has agreed to come and talk a little bit about the events that have been occurring politically in the past year or so, where things are moving very quickly, and it's raising some very interesting questions that it's great that Olivia's offered to come and chat about. So Olivia, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm a third-year student at Illinois Wesleyan, which is just in the middle of Illinois, and I'm studying abroad in my spring semester right now. So the program I was doing, it was 5 weeks of classes, and then you take 2 weeks of finals. And then right now is my internship, and I'm working with my MSP, which means Member of Scottish Parliament, on a project that they requested, which will help them in their constituency work and in Parliament.
Okay. Thank you, Olivia. So there's been a number of significant kind of votes that's taken place in the UK recently. One of which has been a vote for Britain to leave Europe, and I think on Wednesday this week, Article 50 is going to be triggered. That's going to start the process of leaving Europe. I was wondering if you could explain what Brexit is.
Yeah. So Article 50 being triggered is Article 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon, which is the formal treaty that established the European Union. So because no one's ever left the European Union before, it's been a little bit of a tricky process figuring out how to actually leave. So Article 50 being triggered signals the beginning of the 2 years of negotiation that will start between the UK and the rest of the EU about what their relationship will look like after Brexit, basically, which means the UK will leave the single market, which is the whole market that the EU is in and makes trade very easy, and that they'll no longer be in the EU politically, and they won't be controlled by the EU Council at all. And so the 2 years of negotiation, they're very strict about that, no more, no less kind of thing. So exactly 2 years from Wednesday, assuming it doesn't fall on a weekend or something weird, they'll formally be out of the EU.
And why do you think Britain as a whole voted in the referendum to leave Europe?
So if you look at the campaigns, first of all, the Remain campaign was all run by political elites, as you would call them. Every past prime minister of the UK was in the Remain campaign and campaigning. And it wasn't a very attractive campaign, their arguments just weren't as appealing, especially even if you look at the websites that are still up. The Remain campaign was just very boring and kind of dead. The Leave campaign had a lot of emotion behind it. They used the line that the EU had the slowest growth rate, out of all the countries or something like that. And then a lot to do with immigration, especially with the immigration crisis going on right now. Even though the UK has their own system because they're an island and they have their own border patrol, there are just a lot of fears about immigration and things like that, and ultimately that outweighed economic concerns of leaving the single market.
Okay. In terms of Scotland, though, Scotland took a different path in when you actually look at how Scotland voted.
Yeah,
so
Scotland,
talk a little bit about was Scotland different from the UK?
Yeah, so I think it was only England and Wales that voted to voted to leave, sorry. And then it was Scotland and North Ireland that both voted to remain. Scotland was about 80% or 70% to 30%, I think, something like
62.
that.
62 to
62, okay. So yeah, it was definitely a clear majority that voted to remain in Scotland, whereas the UK voted as a whole, it was 55, 45?
About 52,
okay.
53, 47, very close.
Very close,
across
yeah.
the UK.
But regardless of that, over 1 million people in Scotland still voted to leave, even though the percentages.
Was quite good. So we have an interesting position where the majority of the Scottish people voted to stay in Europe, and then but the majority of the United Kingdom voted to leave. And then there's a slight difference between how we're leaving, and I think that's quite important. And you mentioned that there's being a part of Europe as part of the political union, but there's also being a part of the kind of economic union and being part of a single trade kind of area. Do you think the people who voted to leave perhaps thought that would still be part of that trade, or do you think it's sometimes called a hard Brexit, where we completely withdraw from all trade agreements as well as all political agreements?
Yeah, I feel like that's a problem in general with the referendum. It wasn't very clear or specific about what was going to happen, but I think the UK government is taking it very literally, which they feel obligated to do. If you look at David Cameron wasn't in support of leaving the EU. Theresa May wasn't in support of leaving the EU either, but they believe that they're respecting what the people voted for. Obviously, they're still going to be they're going to have some type of trading relationship with the EU, but it's not going to look like what it does now. And I think that they see it as respecting what the people voted for, not as a hard Brexit, which being part of the EU, the single market is one of the vital things of the EU. So they see that as, if we're going to leave the EU, then this is part of the EU.
Yeah, I was thinking also about the Scottish people who voted to leave as well. I wonder if in Scotland there's an even higher majority who want to be part of that trading agreement, even if they want to be politically separate. Yeah. Given that vote.
Well, yeah, it's very interesting because the campaigns, they really only talk about how important the EU is for trade with Scotland, but actually, in terms of trading relationships, UK is the #1 important trading partner for Scotland, and then it's like the rest of the world, and then it's like the EU.
Yeah. So England remains. That's a nice segue into what's happening in Scotland now. So that's the broader situation with the United Kingdom. Scotland voted differently, although what people voted for in a way is an open question because it wasn't necessarily laid out how that would happen. But whatever happens on Wednesday, Article 50 is going to be triggered, and then Britain will be leaving the UK will be leaving the EU. So how did Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, react to this? So what's happening in Scotland as a response to this? Do you want to take us back a bit?
Yeah.
You can take us a bit.
I think it's important to go back to 2014 when they had their first independence referendum, and a lot of people actually thought, like a few nights before, that it was actually going to pass, and then it didn't with, I think it was 55-45.
That's correct, yeah. And there were some polls coming out literally the day before showing it was, a few days, a week before, showing it was almost 50-50 in the polls. So everyone in Scotland thought, well, this could be really, really quite close. Yeah. And but then it was, as you say.
And then they actually did it, yeah. So that was in 2014. So now, Nicola Sturgeon announced 2 weeks ago, I think, that what they're voting for in the Scottish Parliament right now is to see if the Scottish Parliament will seek a second independence referendum from Westminster. Right now, the SNP only has 63 seats, and you need 65 to pass a vote. So it's assumed that the Greens will join with them and that it will pass. So they've been debating it for a few days, and tomorrow is like their last day of debating, and then I think tomorrow's when they vote.
That's good. And how can Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP argue, given that we had a vote in 2014, how can she argue that we need another vote?
Her main argument is that the political situation has changed. That was the manifesto she ran on, and they claim that they had the largest constituency vote they've ever had before. So even though they don't have a majority right now, they've won the most constituencies that they've ever won. And then with that win, they ran on the manifesto that they would hold another referendum if the political climate changed, basically. Even though that's very vague, they consider this to be a change.
If there was a material change in circumstances, a significant material change in circumstances, and so Nicola Sturgeon is arguing that because in the last referendum, the claim was that the assumption was union would bring us membership of the European Union. And that was actually part of the campaign, actually, for Remain, was that if you left, you put that membership at risk. So in the first time, the argument is that Nicola Sturgeon is presenting that people were voting in a way partly, Europe was part of that equation, and since that is a significant material change in circumstances, then she feels almost it's a duty to ask the Scottish people again whether they want, what constitutional arrangement would they like. But not without risk, because what do the polls say at the moment? Do you know what the polls are saying at the moment?
About
whether the Scots would vote for independence?
I don't know. There was one poll that came out right before she announced that Scots were 50-50 about independence.
Yeah.
But all the polls I've seen since say that Scots really do not want a second independence referendum.
So it's about, the question of whether we want a referendum is actually closer. It's about 50-50 if you ask the question, do you want a referendum before or close to the vote? So in the next 2 to 4 years. If you just say before, then it's only about 30% who want a referendum. But if you're careful about the question, it's still around about 50-50 whether the Scots would like a referendum. But in terms of the vote, if there was a referendum, it's still, a slight majority of Scots say no, they would vote no in any referendum. So this poses a kind of tremendous risk in a way for the SNP to hold a referendum and then lose it, because their platform is Scottish independence. So it does look like Nicola Sturgeon is doing this because she sees it as a kind of duty. It's a manifesto pledge that she's made to do this. But it's so what are the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats and the Labour saying about a referendum?
One of the main reasons that people want a referendum is because they want to be part of the EU. But if Scotland were to become independent, EU representatives have made it very clear that Scotland can't just automatically join. Scotland's debt to GDP ratio is 3 times the rate that it needs to be in order to join the EU. They haven't been able to answer what their currency would be, which is a big deal, and mostly economic concerns.
So economic. So Britain, England would still be the most significant trade partner, while Europe would be about 4 times. We do about 4 times the amount of trade with England than we do with Europe. And then the debt, as you say, there's a significant amount of debt. And the SNP reply to this and say, well, it's a bit negative to say we're too wee and too poor to kind of make it as an independent country. And then the Conservatives and the Lib Dems and the Labour say, well, we are too poor to make it as an independent country. So you should think about your economic future rather than your political future. And I love asking this question to Americans because of your relationship to England, your historical relationship. So if someone went to General Washington and said, look at the English Empire, look at the economic security England brings you as a nation. Do you really want to fight a bloody war and cut yourself off from all these trade ties, this wonderful opportunity that England brings you? Okay, so we're not giving you representation and we're taxing you, but hey, think about your economic situation and what England brings to you. So what would you have argued, do you think, in the 18th century as an American?
Yeah, so I don't think it's directly comparable to Scotland though, just because Scotland does have representation in Westminster.
Yeah, that's right.
And Scotland does disproportionately benefit from the Barnett formula, which is how the tax blocks are redistributed. When you look at it, Scotland gets 20% more than compared to its population.
Okay, so if America was given the vote and had been better supported by England, do you think they should have voted to become independent?
I mean, I think, looking back at that, I think it was a much different time. You didn't have the media to talk about all the negative effects of what was going to happen. I think obviously they created one of the greatest countries after that. And the main...
Like, part of me, when I
Yeah.
kind of think about America, it was a very bold experiment. I think it was a hugely risky experiment.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it
it
was
was,
very hard.
and I think if anyone had said, look, you know, this is going to cause war, tremendous hardship, massive death, but it's worth it to have self-determination as a nation, you know, to move forward. Is that argument at all applicable in Scotland?
I understand the emotional argument. It's just really hard to look at it from, like, I can completely understand, like, the nationalist, we want a say for us kind of thing, but it just doesn't make sense economically. And having the Scottish Parliament, they do have a lot of say over the everyday things, health, education, things like that, that I don't really think they're taking full advantage of right now. So in terms of funding these things, where Scotland is definitely much more social, they would lose a lot of the funding for their way of life and their culture here.
Yeah. I think there's clearly the economic arguments are there, and it's certainly not certain that Scotland will succeed. I mean, there were arguments about oil and hydrocarbon resources and renewable resources. So Scotland does arguably have a very strong economic platform or base to develop. And you can make comparisons to Scandinavian countries like Norway and Denmark and other countries. And Norway actually, quite interestingly, set up an oil reserve when they discovered oil. So instead of just spending all the money they get from oil, they actually put some money aside, and that left Norway in a very strong economic position. But Scotland was never in a position to do that because it was Britain's oil that actually generated that wealth. And that was part of the debate last time around. But now oil, the actual value of oil has dropped a great deal. So oil is probably not going to be kind of a big part of that economic argument. In terms of representation, that's a really interesting question. So you could argue that the Americans were taxed but had no representation in Parliament. So how can the Scots argue, how could the SNP argue that in some way they're not represented by British or Westminster, as they describe Westminster politics?
Yeah. It's mostly because of size. Like, England is 85% of the UK, I think, and Scotland only has 5 million people. So the seats are distributed based on population. So obviously Scotland only has 59 of the 650 seats. So recently, as they've diverged more and more from, because they used to vote, England and Scotland used to vote pretty much the same, and then they started to diverge more and more in the 1980s, 1970s, to be more social. And so now, even though they vote for a social government, that never wins, and a conservative government wins because that's what England votes for.
So the SNP is a centre-left political party, and then in Westminster we have a conservative leader who's got different, not quite Republican and Democrat, but they're kind of slightly opposed to high taxes. The Conservatives, well, the left position is perhaps more in favour of a progressive taxation system. So there's a divergence in kind of attitudes towards left and right in Scotland. So that might be interesting in the new referendum, where if the Scots think, okay, well, we'd like more of a leftist politics across the United Kingdom, but is the left credible in England at the moment under its current leadership?
With Jeremy Corbyn?
Yeah.
I would say not exactly. Yeah.
So the left is struggling to,
just with past campaigns and things like that, and people seeing them as aligning with conservatives in campaigns, they're definitely not as credible.
So it's harder to make the argument that the Scottish values, the political values, it's probably not really such a thing as Scottish values, but if you take a poll of people, the slight trending towards a leftist view in Scotland. But having said that, the Conservative Party is doing very well in Scotland at the moment. It's polling at about 28%. Labour's at almost 15%, which is astonishing. And then the SNP are polling in the high 40s in terms of that. So it's still a dominantly left set of values. But I think that will be a question in the new referendum, to what extent the values. So even though Scotland has representation in the Westminster Parliament, it's to what extent will the Scots see a joint effort. Is it? And Gordon Brown made this argument in the last referendum. He said, look, Scotland can shape the future of the United Kingdom. We're in this partnership together.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we are. You know, we shouldn't be one group divided against another group. We should be part of this kind of collective kind of movement kind of forward. But if Scotland really feels it can't shape the future of Britain, then that argument becomes a bit harder, perhaps, in this referendum. But yeah, it's incredible. Are you enjoying? I think. Thank you, Olivia. You've kind of. Is there any other things we've kind of missed? I suppose English votes for English laws. Do you know about that?
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that? That cuts to the representation question a bit.
Yeah.
As well.
So because of the asymmetric devolution that goes on with Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, the Parliament became where it was only domestically voting for England things because domestic issues had all been devolved to the other countries. And so England basically was like left out of it kind of thing, where like Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland representatives could vote on only laws that affected English people. So because of that, they made the English votes for English laws, so only English MPs vote for laws that affect England domestically.
Yeah, I think on a political level that kind of makes sense, but on a practical level, it means that the Scottish, because it's such a large percentage of the population, and the funding decisions that affect that will ripple out, then Gordon Brown's argument that we're all in it together kind of gets undermined a wee bit. So I guess the population imbalance becomes crucial, is it? And then I think for me it became an interesting question, because could a Scottish MP ever become a leader in Westminster if they never voted on issues that impacted on the English people? To me it seems that was the problem. That was a big problem. It's Gordon Brown's argument, we're all in it together. So yes, it was a political imbalance, and it was unfair to the English that they couldn't have a say on Scottish matters, but Scottish MPs or Welsh MPs or Northern Irish MPs could have a say on the matter. But that kind of collective, we're all in it together, I think got undermined just a little bit by that. But anyway, I just wanted to bring that in, because that's another interesting dimension. Just being in Parliament, is it exciting being in Scotland while this is happening?
Yeah, I definitely did not imagine that this is what would be happening when I was here.
Yeah.
When I was like preparing to come, everyone was like, "Oh, it's so interesting, what's going on?" I was like, "Yeah." Like I didn't foresee, like I didn't know enough about Article 50 being triggered and things like that to foresee that would happen when I was here, or that Nicola Sturgeon would call another independence referendum. So yeah, it definitely makes things interesting. You definitely learn more about each of the parties through this.
So there's the kind of practical running of the country that takes place within the Scottish Parliament, but then these huge constitutional questions about nationhood, national identity. What is our relationship? So, any other comments or thoughts?
Not really.
Having a good time?
Yeah, I am. I really enjoy working with my MSP. I think getting to know your office is one of the best things about it.
Do you feel you have an important role kind of within that team?
Not yet. This will be my 4th week. So we're almost halfway through. But I'm going to start hopefully doing more with like his social media and possibly making videos and things like that. So I'm really excited to do that.
That's fantastic. Do you want to call out your MSP?
Oliver Mundell, who is the representative for Dumfriesshire in the Borders.
Fantastic. Okay.
Yep.
Olivia, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for explaining to the world. Good.